the Asylum of Shadows. On the edge of Weston, West Virginia, a massive fortress of stone rises against the skyline. Its towers and endless rows of windows stretch across nearly a quarter mile, making it one of the largest hand-cut stone masonry buildings in the world. At first glance, the structure could be mistaken for a grand university or a sprawling estate. But the walls of this place were not built to house scholars or aristocrats. They were built to contain the unwanted, the unstable, and the forgotten. This was the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, America's monument to madness. From the moment its doors opened in the 1860s, the asylum carried with it a dark aura. Locals whispered about the strange cries that seemed to echo from its halls at night, long before the first patient even set foot inside. Some claimed the land itself was cursed, noting that the asylum was constructed on ground that had once seen violence during the American Civil War. Soldiers had marched across its fields, blood had been spilled, and now stone walls rose to confine a different kind of battlefield the human mind. Imagine standing before its entrance at twilight. The last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across the courtyard, and the immense central clock tower looms overhead like a sentinel frozen in time. The air is heavy, the silence unsettling. You feel watched, though no one is near. It is in this moment that the asylum reveals its nature. Not merely a building, but a presence, alive with the residue of generations who lived and suffered within. According to historical records, the asylum was originally designed with noble intentions. It was meant to be a place of healing, a sanctuary where those struggling with mental illness could find treatment and compassion. But as years passed, those intentions crumbled beneath the weight of overcrowding, underfunding, and neglect. What was once imagined as a beacon of progress soon became a chamber of horrors. The asylum's legacy would not be one of cure, but of torment. From the outside, the building projects permanence, massive sandstone walls quarried by hand, fitted together with the precision of Gothic revival architecture. But inside, the story was fragile, chaotic, and tragic. Echoing hallways bore witness to screams and sobs, to treatments that blurred the line between medicine and torture, and to lives extinguished in silence. It is said that over 2,400 patients died within these walls, their spirits still tethered to the place where their suffering ended. For those who walk the corridors today, the air carries more than just dust. It carries memory, pain, and something that refuses to let go. The asylum has earned its reputation as one of the most haunted places in America, not simply because of ghost stories, but because of the history embedded in its very foundation. Every arch, every cell, every iron-barred window is a reminder that this was once the edge of society's conscience. Here, the unwanted were hidden away, out of sight, out of mind, and too often out of hope. Even now, visitors describe an atmosphere so oppressive that it presses on the chest, making breathing difficult. The shadows here are not just tricks of light, they feel watchful, deliberate. This opening chapter sets the stage for a journey into the asylum's depths, its origins, its patience, its horrors, and its enduring legends. Over the next chapters, we will unravel the story of how a grand vision of healing collapsed into neglect and cruelty, how human suffering became entwined with whispers of the supernatural, and why. Even today, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands as a grim reminder that madness never truly leaves, it lingers. Foundations of Madness, 1-8581864. The story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum begins not with screams or hauntings, but with blueprints and stone. In 1858, construction began on what was then called the Weston State Hospital, envisioned as a sanctuary for the mentally ill in Western Virginia, before the region became West Virginia during the Civil War. The design followed the Kirkbride Plan, an architectural philosophy created by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, who believed that environment played a crucial role in healing the mind. His plan called for sprawling wings, sunlight-filled windows, and fresh air, all intended to create a sense of order and calm. The Trans-Allegheny Asylum would become one of the largest examples of this vision ever attempted. The scale of the project was immense. Built almost entirely by hand, workers quarried sandstone from nearby hills, shaping and stacking each block into walls that rose 4 stories high. Immigrant laborers and prison convicts worked side by side, their sweat and effort etched into every inch of the structure. The building was designed to house just 250 patients, each in their own room with access to light and ventilation. In theory, it was a radical departure from the dark, dungeon-like asylums of the past. But even before it opened, the asylum's foundations were marked by turmoil. The Civil War erupted in 1861, and the nearly completed building was seized by Union troops. Weston, located in a border state torn by divided loyalties, became a site of conflict. The asylum, with its sturdy walls and strategic location, was transformed into a military garrison. Soldiers camped in its unfinished halls, using its grounds to store weapons and supplies. The hopeful vision of a hospital of healing was delayed by the clash of bayonets and the march of armies. According to historical accounts, Confederate raiders briefly reclaimed Weston, seizing nearly $30,000 in gold from the local bank that had been stored for the asylum's construction. But the Union soon retook the town, and the building remained under military occupation for much of the war. For locals, the asylum became less a beacon of hope than a symbol of conflict, its stone walls echoing with the tramp of boots rather than the quiet promise of care. When the war ended in 1865, construction resumed in earnest. The asylum's long wings stretched outward like arms, each designed to separate patients by gender, diagnosis, and behavior. Kirkbride believed that order could be restored to disordered minds by surrounding patients with beauty and discipline. Gardens, courtyards, and open spaces were integrated into the design. Wide hallways allowed air to circulate, while tall ceilings gave an impression of grandeur and dignity. Yet even in its earliest days, cracks appeared in the vision. The asylum cost far more than anticipated, draining state resources and sparking criticism from legislators. Some argued that such lavish construction was wasted on the insane, who, in the cruel parlance of the era, were seen as lost causes. Others defended the investment, insisting that a civilized society must care for its weakest members. The debate foreshadowed the struggles that would define the institution's future, lofty ideals colliding with harsh realities. When the first patients were admitted in 1864, they entered a building still bearing scars of the war. Some of the walls were blackened by fire, others patched hastily. The grounds were littered with remnants of military-used broken wagons, discarded uniforms, and even graves. The asylum began its life not as a sanctuary, but as a place haunted by violence and loss. This history would cling to it for decades, feeding rumors that the very stones were soaked in suffering. Still, there was optimism among reformers. They hoped that the Trans-Allegheny Asylum would prove the worth of Kirkbride's vision, that would heal minds shattered by trauma and illness. Patients were encouraged to work in gardens, participate in crafts, and benefit from the symmetry and order of their surroundings. For a brief moment, the dream seemed alive, a house of healing rising from the ashes of war. But as history would show, the foundations of the asylum carried not only stone and mortar, but the seeds of madness yet to come. The Kirkbride plan's ideals would falter under the weight of overcrowding, neglect, and misunderstanding. What was meant to be a monument to compassion would, within decades, become infamous for cruelty. And those who walk its halls today still wonder, did the violence of its birth curse it from the beginning? The grand opening and first patients. In 1864, even before the guns of the Civil War fell silent, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum admitted its first patients. The structure, still incomplete in many areas, nevertheless opened its doors to men and women whose families could no longer care for them, or had been deemed unfit to live in society. What entered through those doors was not merely illness, but a reflection of the 19th century's understanding and misunderstanding of the human mind. The first patients were drawn from across the region, transported in wagons or escorted on foot to the grand stone building that loomed over Weston. Some came with diagnoses that today would be treated with counseling or medication: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. Others were admitted for reasons that now seem shockingly trivial: masturbatory habits, religious excitement, or domestic trouble. According to admission logs, one woman was committed simply for reading too many novels. In an age when mental illness was poorly understood, the asylum became a catch-all for the unwanted, the eccentric, and the inconvenient. At its opening, the asylum reflected the optimism of the Kirkbride plan. Patients were given single rooms, airy windows, and access to gardens. The philosophy emphasized routine and productivity, so men worked in fields and workshops, while women sewed, cooked, or tended to laundry. The idea was that order and meaningful labor would calm agitated minds. For a brief period, the halls echoed not only with cries, but with laughter, song, and the rhythmic hum of industry. But the optimism soon met harsh reality. Staffing was minimal, and training was inadequate. Doctors rotated through with little oversight, and attendants often had no background in medicine. Although some sought to offer genuine care, others treated their charges with cruelty or neglect. In those first years, incidents of violence, both patient on patient and staff on patient, already began to appear in reports. One physician noted that the asylum quickly became a repository for individuals who were not mentally ill at all. Orphans, alcoholics, epileptics, and even political dissenters were committed, their lives swallowed by the institution. The ideal of individualized treatment gave way to the practical reality of confinement. For families, the asylum became a place to hide away shame, whether the cause was illness, poverty, or scandal. Still, stories survive of staff who tried to uphold Kirkbride's dream. Nurses wrote of creating bonds with patients, teaching them to garden or paint. Some patients improved, and a few even left the asylum to return to their communities. But these successes were overshadowed by the grim arithmetic of an expanding population. Even within its first decade, the number of patients began to exceed the building's design. Where once there had been a single patient per room, beds were doubled, then tripled, crammed into wards meant for far fewer. The asylum's early patients left behind fragments of their voices' letters never sent, journals hidden away. One entry, preserved in archives, reads, "I came here to be cured, but I feel the walls themselves feed on me. The air is heavy, the night's long. I forget what the sky looks like." These testimonies, though rare, remind us that behind the statistics were human lives, each with a story erased by confinement. As the doors opened wider, the reputation of the asylum spread. Some communities viewed it as a blessing, a place that removed the burden of care from families. Others whispered that it was a place of punishment, where husbands sent wives for disobedience, or where inconvenient relatives were discarded. The truth, as always, was tangled. The asylum was both a refuge and a prison, a site of attempted healing and of silent suffering. The grand opening of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was meant to symbolize progress, but from its very beginning, the contradictions were clear. Hope coexisted with despair, compassion with cruelty, and in the long shadow of its tower, patients began lives defined not by who they were, but by where they had been sent. The asylum had opened its doors, and with them, the first chapter of a legacy that would come to be defined not by promise, but by pain. Overcrowding and decline. 1880s, 1900s. By the 1880s, the dream of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum as a sanctuary for the mentally ill had begun to collapse under the crushing weight of overcrowding. Originally designed to house 250 patients in relative comfort, the facility now swelled with more than 10 times that number. By some reports, over 2,500 souls were crammed into the asylum's sprawling wings and echoing halls. The Kirkbride plan, which had once promised light, air, and order, was now twisted into a labyrinth of misery. The overcrowding was not merely a statistic, it was a living nightmare. Patients were packed into rooms meant for one, with iron beds jammed so close that attendants could barely move between them. In some wards, patients slept on the floor, their bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. The once spacious halls echoed, not with calm, but with the constant din of voices, cries, and the shuffle of restless feet. Privacy disappeared, and with it, dignity. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. With too few attendants for the swelling population, neglect became inevitable. Basic hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Toilets overflowed, foul smells hung in the air, and disease spread unchecked. Patients bathed infrequently, sometimes only once a month, and lice and vermin became constant companions. The gardens that had once been intended as therapeutic spaces lay untended, overrun by weeds. Instead of restoring order, the environment deepened chaos. Violence became commonplace. Overwhelmed staff could not control the masses of patients, many of whom were agitated, delusional, or aggressive. Fights broke out daily, with patients attacking one another with fists, improvised weapons, or even teeth. Attendants, underpaid and poorly trained, often resorted to brutality themselves. Beatings, restraints, and solitary confinement became the default response to unruly behavior. Some staff succumbed to despair or corruption, abusing their positions in ways that left scars on the asylum's reputation for decades. Medical treatment, already primitive by modern standards, suffered under the strain. Overworked doctors rotated from ward to ward, offering little more than cursory examinations. Those who sought to practice compassionate care were undermined by lack of resources and overwhelming caseloads. More often than not, treatment meant sedation or containment rather than therapy. Families who entrusted their loved ones to the asylum rarely saw improvement, and many never saw their relatives again. One newspaper article from the late 19th century described the asylum as a human warehouse, a place where society stored away its inconvenient, its troubled, and its poor. Patients admitted for minor conditions, grief, melancholy, or epilepsy found themselves trapped among the severely disturbed, their prospects for recovery evaporating. The walls that had once symbolized hope now represented a life sentence. Reports from this period also tell of desperate attempts to escape. Some patients scaled walls or slipped past guards, only to be recaptured or perish in the surrounding wilderness. Others staged uprisings, briefly seizing control of wards before being subdued by force. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense of hopelessness. The asylum, once envisioned as a refuge, had become a prison. The decline did not go unnoticed by the public. Local residents whispered about the cries that drifted across the fields at night, unsettling reminders of the suffering inside. Journalists who toured the asylum published scathing exposes describing filth, overcrowding, and abuse. Legislators debated funding, but solutions rarely matched the scale of the crisis. The state, struggling with limited resources, chose containment over compassion. For the patients, life blurred into a cycle of monotony and despair. Days were marked by the clang of meal trays, the shouts of attendants, and the occasional outburst of violence. Nights offered little respite, with snores, sobs, and screams echoing through the wards. Hope dwindled with each passing year, replaced by resignation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had already shifted from its founder's vision of enlightened care to a cautionary tale of institutional failure. The overcrowding had broken not just the building's design, but its very purpose. The asylum was no longer a place of healing, it was a place where suffering multiplied and where the line between patient and prisoner blurred beyond recognition. The decline had begun, and it would only deepen. Treatments or tortures. By the turn of the 20th century, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had descended into conditions so desperate that so-called treatments blurred the line between medicine and cruelty. While the building itself had been designed with compassion in mind, the therapies that emerged in its wards reflected a darker reality of psychiatry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At first, treatments were limited to sedation and confinement. Patients were dosed with bromides, chloroform, or chloral hydrate to calm their agitation, often leaving them in states of stupor. Hydrotherapy was another common practice. Patients were strapped into tubs of cold water for hours, or wrapped tightly in wet sheets that dried stiff against their skin, immobilizing them. Doctors claimed the shock to the system eased anxiety. Survivors described it as torture. As psychiatry evolved, the asylum became a testing ground for experimental procedures. In the 1930s and 1940s, insulin coma therapy was introduced. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin until they collapsed into comas, only to be revived with glucose. Doctors believed the treatment reset the brain, but many patients never fully recovered, and some died during the procedure. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, then administered without anesthesia, left patients writhing and biting down on leather straps as electric currents surged through their skulls. But the most infamous practice associated with Trans-Allegheny was the prefrontal lobotomy. In the 1940s, the asylum became one of the busiest sites for this controversial surgery. Dr. Walter Freeman, known as the father of the American lobotomy, visited the hospital in his traveling van dubbed the Lobotomobile. Armed with little more than an ice-pick-like instrument and a mallet, he performed thousands of operations, often in assembly line fashion. Patients were rendered docile, stripped of violent impulses, but also of their personalities, memories, and in many cases, basic functioning. For families desperate for relief, it seemed a miracle. For patients, it was often a living death. Records suggest that hundreds of lobotomies were performed at Trans-Allegheny alone. Survivors sometimes wandered the wards afterward like ghosts, vacant-eyed, their independence erased. Others died on the table. The procedure was hailed at the time as a breakthrough, even winning its inventor a Nobel Prize. Today, it is remembered as one of medicine's darkest chapters. Beyond these headline-grabbing procedures, countless smaller indignities define treatment. Straitjackets, restraints, and isolation rooms were routine. Patients were chained to beds, locked in cages, or confined to pitch-dark cells for days. The goal was not to heal, but to control. Attendants, overwhelmed and undertrained, often resorted to force when patients failed. For many, the asylum became less a hospital than a warehouse of human suffering. Yet it would be simplistic to say there was no compassion. Some doctors and nurses genuinely sought to improve patients' lives. Occupational therapy, group activities, and even art and music programs existed sporadically. Patients were encouraged to farm, to build, to create efforts that sometimes offered genuine solace. But these programs were too often overshadowed by the harsher measures and by a system strained beyond its limits. For visitors today, it is these treatments that haunt the imagination. Walking through the asylum's wards, one can still see the hydrotherapy tubs, the restraints, the padded cells. Guides describe the lobotomy theater, where Dr. Freeman's patients were lined up for their turns. The air seems heavy with echoes of cries that never found release. The question lingers, were these treatments ever about healing, or were they simply ways to silence those whom society did not understand? In this way, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum reflects not just its own history, but the history of psychiatry itself, a field marked by noble intentions, flawed science, and too often, cruelty disguised as care. For the thousands who endured these treatments, the asylum was not a place of recovery. It was a crucible of pain, where the line between therapy and torture all but vanished. Staff in the shadows. Behind the walls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the staff walked a thin line between caretakers and wardens. They were the doctors, nurses, attendants, and guards tasked with managing thousands of patients under impossible conditions. In theory, they were the protectors of the vulnerable. In practice, many became enforcers of a brutal system that crushed both patients and workers alike. The asylum's workforce was chronically understaffed, with as many as 2,500 patients crammed into a facility designed for 250. Attendants were stretched far beyond their limits. A single nurse might oversee a ward of dozens, while guards were responsible for keeping order in halls where violence simmered constantly. Exhaustion and stress broke down compassion. Those who entered with genuine desire to help often found themselves hardened, their humanity eroded by endless chaos. Doctors rotated frequently, many young and inexperienced. For some, the asylum was a proving ground, a place to practice new treatments on a captive population. Others simply endured their tenure before moving on to more lucrative private practices. Reports suggest that a few physicians were dedicated and kind, but their efforts were overwhelmed by systemic neglect. The sheer volume of patients made individual care nearly impossible. Medical notes became brief, perfunctory, reduced to phrases like restless, agitated, or incoherent. Lives were reduced to shorthand. Nurses bore the greatest burden. They provided basic care, administered drugs, and tried to maintain order in wards overflowing with despair. Some wrote of compassion, describing small victories, a patient who calmed with a song, or one who smiled during a walk in the gardens. But others resorted to indifference or cruelty, restraining patients for hours, ignoring cries, or administering sedatives to keep peace. Abuse cases occasionally surfaced. Patients beaten, left without food, or locked in filthy rooms as punishment. Whistleblowers were rare, silenced by fear of losing their jobs. Attendants and guards often came from local farming families, drawn by steady pay rather than any calling to medicine. Many had no training. Their duties were less about healing and more about control, breaking up fights, restraining violent patients, and keeping order. Some used brute force liberally, treating patients more like prisoners than wards. Stories of attendants striking patients with batons, locking them in cages, or taunting them echo through historical records. Yet, it would be unfair to paint all staff with one brush. Testimonies also exist of individuals who showed remarkable patience and kindness. A few nurses smuggled in books or treats for patients. One attendant was remembered for teaching illiterate men to write their names. These small acts of humanity were sparks of light in otherwise dark halls. But they were exceptions, not the rule. The staff themselves were not immune to the asylum's horrors. Attacks on employees were frequent. Guards were stabbed with improvised weapons. Nurses assaulted during nightly rounds. Some staff vanished without explanation, their fates whispered about but never confirmed. Others succumbed to nervous breakdowns, their own minds unraveling under the constant strain. In some cases, former staff became patients, admitted to the very wards they once patrolled. The blurred lines between caretaker and oppressor defined the staff of Trans-Allegheny. Trapped in a system that demanded order over healing, many abandoned compassion to survive. For patients, The staff were the face of the institution, sometimes kind, often cruel, always inescapable. For the staff, the asylum was both livelihood and prison, a place that consumed their energy, their ideals, and sometimes their sanity. In the shadows of Trans-Allegheny, the staff were not merely background figures. They were participants in a drama of suffering, complicit in a cycle of neglect, yet also victims of it. Their presence haunts the history of the asylum as surely as the spirits of the dead, a reminder that institutions deform not only those confined within, but those who serve them. The voices of patients. Among the stone walls and barred windows of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the voices of patients struggled to be heard. Most were silenced by history, their names lost in ledgers and their lives reduced to statistics. But fragments remain: letters unsent, journals hidden, testimonies from those who lived and died within the asylum. These voices reveal not only the horrors of confinement, but the humanity that endured despite it. Admission logs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show the disturbing range of reasons people were institutionalized. Some suffered from genuine mental illnesses, schizophrenia, severe depression, or bipolar disorder. Others were committed for epilepsy, alcoholism, or dementia, conditions poorly understood at the time. Still others were locked away for reasons that seem absurd today: novel reading, imaginary female trouble, religious excitement, or simply disobedience. In many cases, the asylum functioned less as a hospital and more as a dumping ground for those who defied social norms. For the patients themselves, the experience was often one of bewilderment and despair. In a letter never sent, a young woman wrote, "I asked why I was here, and they told me it was for my nerves. I feel no better, but worse. The nights are endless, and I dream of my mother's face. I think they have forgotten me." Another entry from a male patient reads, "There are too many of us. We crowd together like cattle. Some fight, some weep, some lie still as stones. The doctors come, but do not stay. I think they do not see us as people." Diaries discovered in the archives speak of longing for freedom, of small joys found in friendships, and of fears that grew in the silence of night. One patient described listening to the clock tower chime, each hour a reminder of another day lost. Another recounted how a stray cat that wandered the grounds became a source of comfort, a rare sign of gentleness in a world of restraints and orders. Some patients tried to resist. Records mention hunger strikes, refusals to work, or attempts to escape. One man carved his name into the wooden frame of his bed, as if to assert his existence against the erasure of the institution. Another scratched poems onto the walls of his cell, fragments of which can still be traced today. These acts of defiance were often punished, but they reveal a spirit not entirely broken. Yet for every story of defiance, there are dozens of despair. Families often abandoned their loved ones once they were committed, visits dwindling to nothing. Patients wrote letters begging to come home, letters that were never mailed. The staff sometimes intercepted correspondence, deeming it disruptive. The result was a suffocating isolation, a sense that the world beyond the gates no longer remembered those trapped inside. Some stories are hauntingly specific. One woman, committed for melancholia after the death of her child, wrote in her journal, "They tell me I will recover, but I do not believe it. I see my baby in the corners of the room, reaching for me. When I call out, they say it is madness. But I know what I see." Another patient, a veteran of the Civil War, described waking each night to the sound of marching boots in the hall's echoes of his trauma, or perhaps the restless ghosts of soldiers who once occupied the grounds. Today, visitors to the asylum often report hearing whispers in empty corridors or feeling sudden chills. Some believe these are the lingering voices of patients, still seeking recognition. Others see them as echoes of pain, memories imprinted on stone. Whatever the explanation, the effect is undeniable. The voices of the patients, once silenced, continue to speak in their own way. In remembering these fragments, we confront the human side of the asylum's history. Beyond the statistics of overcrowding and the accounts of treatments, there were individuals with hopes, fears, and identities. They were more than patients, they were people, erased by stigma, but not entirely forgotten. Their voices, fragile and fractured, still linger in the silence of Trans-Allegheny, demanding to be heard. Escapes, violence, and death. Life inside the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was defined not only by overcrowding and neglect, but also by the constant shadow of violence and death. With thousands of patients crammed into wards designed for hundreds, tensions simmered endlessly, erupting in acts of desperation and brutality. The asylum became a place where danger lurked in every hallway, and survival often meant enduring not only madness, but also the violence it bred. Escape attempts were frequent. Patients slipped through poorly guarded gates, scaled walls, or vanished into the surrounding forests. Some were quickly recaptured, wandering confused and hungry through the countryside. Others disappeared entirely, their fates never recorded. Newspapers occasionally reported sightings of escaped lunatics, feeding public fears of dangerous madmen at large. In truth, most were not violent, they were desperate to flee the squalor and hopelessness of confinement. But not all escape attempts ended harmlessly. In one chilling incident, a group of patients overpowered an attendant and armed themselves with improvised weapons. They barricaded a ward and held it for hours before being subdued by guards. The aftermath was bloody, with several injured and at least one patient killed. Such rebellions were rare, but underscored the volatility of an institution stretched to its breaking point. Violence among patients was an everyday reality. In crowded wards, tempers flared over food, bedding, or simply the proximity of too many disturbed minds in too small a space. Records describe stabbings with sharpened spoons, strangulations with strips of cloth, and beatings that left victims maimed or dead. Attendants, too few in number to intervene effectively, often arrived too late. Some grew indifferent, treating assaults as inevitable. Others participated, taking out their frustrations on the very people they were meant to protect. Death stalked the asylum in many forms. Disease thrived in the unsanitary conditions. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza swept through the wards, claiming countless lives. Malnutrition and neglect weakened patients further. Suicide was another grim constant. Patients hanged themselves with bed sheets, drowned in bathtubs, or hurled themselves from windows. Each death was a testament to despair, and each was swiftly absorbed into the rhythm of institutional life, forgotten almost as soon as it occurred. Some deaths, however, refused to fade into obscurity. Legends tell of particularly brutal murders that left haunting marks on the asylum's reputation. One story recounts 3 patients who turned on a fourth, strangling him and hiding his body beneath a bed. Another tells of a man beaten to death with a bedpost during a dispute. These grim tales, whether embellished or entirely true, linger in the folklore of the asylum, their echoes said to reverberate in the rooms where they occurred. Attacks on staff were equally common. Guards and nurses were stabbed, bludgeoned, or bitten. Some never returned to work, their nerves shattered. Others were said to have vanished entirely, swallowed by the chaos of the asylum. Rumors circulated of staff members murdered and their bodies hidden, though official records are vague or silent on these accounts. The lack of documentation only deepens the sense of mystery and fear surrounding such events. For those who survived, the violence became part of the fabric of daily existence. Patients lived in fear of their neighbors. Staff carried weapons or improvised defenses. The asylum's halls, meant to echo with healing, rang instead with shouts, blows, and cries for help. Death was no stranger, it was a frequent visitor, one that left its mark not only in the cemetery beyond the gates, but in the atmosphere of dread that clings to the building even now. Today, visitors to the abandoned asylum claim to feel that history is still alive. Some describe sudden drops in temperature in rooms where murders occurred. Others report hearing screams or the sound of fists pounding against walls. Paranormal investigators point to these phenomena as evidence of spirits lingering, trapped by the violence of their final moments. Skeptics argue that it is the power of suggestion, the human mind filling silence with echoes. But whatever the cause, the impression is unmistakable. Violence and death have stained the asylum, and their presence lingers in its empty corridors. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was not merely a place of suffering, it was a crucible of conflict, where fragile minds collided with desperate circumstances. Escapes, uprisings, assaults, and deaths were not anomalies, they were the inevitable outcome of a system that had long since collapsed. In these halls, survival itself became a battle, and the memories of that struggle linger like ghosts in the stone. Paranormal roots. Even while the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum operated at full capacity, whispers of the paranormal began to circulate. Staff, patients, and even visitors reported experiences that defied explanation, suggesting that the suffering embedded in the building's walls had given rise to something otherworldly. For some, the asylum was not only a house of madness, it was a house of spirits. Early accounts from nurses and attendants speak of footsteps echoing in empty halls, shadows crossing doorways where no one stood, and sudden chills that gripped entire wards. Some claim to hear voices calling their names, only to find no one nearby. A few insisted that figures lingered in corners, watching silently, vanishing when approached. These stories, whispered among staff, became part of the asylum's unofficial lore. Patients, too, reported strange occurrences. Some said they saw long-dead relatives standing at the foot of their beds. Others described monstrous shapes that lurked in the darkness, their features shifting and grotesque. To the doctors of the time, such visions were symptoms of delusion. But the consistency of the reports, coming from people with vastly different backgrounds, suggested something more unsettling. Even skeptics among the staff admitted there were moments when the asylum seemed alive with presences unseen. One particularly enduring story tells of a spectral woman dressed in white, seen gliding through the women's ward. She was said to appear during times of great distress, her presence followed by a sense of calm. Some believe she was the spirit of a nurse who had once cared for patients with unusual kindness. Others whispered she was a former patient herself, eternally wandering the halls where she had lived and died. Male wards carried their own legends. One ghostly figure, described as tall, gaunt, and with hollow eyes, was said to stalk the violent ward at night. Patients screamed when he appeared, begging attendants to drive him away. Staff who patrolled those corridors admitted feeling watched, their lanterns flickering as they passed through patches of icy air. The asylum's cemetery, where thousands of unclaimed bodies were buried, also became a source of ghost stories. Visitors described strange lights moving among the graves, or the sound of weeping carried on the wind. The sheer number of deaths within the asylum, over 2,400 by some counts, gave fertile ground for belief that restless spirits lingered, unwilling or unable to leave. During the early 20th century, spiritualism was still popular in America, and seances were occasionally held within the asylum's walls. Accounts suggest that both staff and outsiders participated, hoping to contact the dead. Whether genuine or not, these sessions further cemented the asylum's reputation as a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Rumors spread that some patients, already vulnerable, were driven deeper into madness after witnessing unexplained phenomena. By the time the asylum began to decline in the mid-20th century, its reputation as a haunted place was firmly established. Journalists covering stories of overcrowding and mistreatment often noted the eerie atmosphere of the building. Locals spoke of lights in windows long after the asylum had closed for the night. Travelers avoided the grounds after dark, muttering that the screams of the dead could still be heard. Today, paranormal investigators cite these early accounts as evidence that the haunting of Trans-Allegheny did not begin after its closure was always there, woven into the very fabric of the asylum's existence. Skeptics argue that the oppressive conditions, combined with fear and suggestion, created fertile ground for hallucinations and folklore. But believers insist that the building itself absorbed the pain of thousands, and that its stones now resonate with the energy of the past. In either case, the paranormal roots of Trans-Allegheny are undeniable. They form the foundation of its legend, ensuring that the asylum is remembered not only as a site of human suffering, but also as one of the most haunted locations in America. To walk its corridors is to step into a place where the line between history and haunting has always been blurred. Closing the doors, 1994. By the final decades of the 20th century, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had become a relic of an era long past. Psychiatry had changed dramatically, moving away from massive institutions toward community-based care. New medications allowed many patients to live outside of asylums, and public awareness of human rights made the conditions inside places like Trans-Allegheny increasingly intolerable. What had once been hailed as a beacon of progress was now widely seen as a symbol of neglect and abuse. Inspections in the 1980s revealed horrifying conditions. Wards were crumbling, paint peeled from walls, and ceilings dripped from years of neglect. Patients wandered aimlessly, some half-dressed, others sitting silently in corners. Overcrowding had eased somewhat since its peak, but the scars of decades remained. Medical care was minimal, and reports described patients left in their own filth or restrained for long periods. Families who visited were often shocked at the state of their loved ones, and public outrage grew. Lawsuits and exposes began to pile up. Journalists published photographs of decaying wards and interviews with former patients who described years of mistreatment. Advocacy groups pushed for reform, pointing out that the asylum's existence violated modern standards of care and human dignity. State officials, facing mounting pressure, debated whether to renovate the facility or shut it down entirely. The decision was not easy. The asylum was a major employer in Weston, and many locals feared economic ruin if it closed. Generations of families had worked there as nurses, attendants, and support staff. For better or worse, the asylum was woven into the identity of the town. Yet, the tide of history could not be stopped. The movement toward deinstitutionalization, combined with the institution's failing infrastructure, sealed its fate. In 1994, after 130 years of operation, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum officially closed its doors. Patients were transferred to smaller, modern facilities or released into community programs. Some adjusted, others struggled. For many, the transition was as jarring as the decades they had spent behind the asylum's walls. Families reunited with relatives they had long assumed lost, while others mourned the absence of a place, however flawed, that had provided structure. The closure marked the end of an era, but not the end of the asylum story. The massive stone structure remained, its windows boarded or shattered, its halls silent. Local residents described it as a ghost town within a town, an abandoned monument looming over Weston. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement, ivy crawled up the walls, and broken furniture lay scattered in rooms once filled with life. Yet, even in decay, the building radiated a strange power, as if it refused to be forgotten. For the people of Weston, the asylum's closure was bittersweet. Some felt relief that the suffering had finally ended. Others grieved the loss of a cornerstone of their community. however dark. Rumors quickly spread that the building was haunted, its long history of misery leaving an imprint too strong to fade. Paranormal stories multiplied, attracting the curious and the brave to its gates. Today, the closing of the asylum is remembered as both a victory for progress and a reminder of failure. Progress, because patients were no longer warehoused in crumbling wards. Failure, because the asylum had operated for so long under such dire conditions. Its end was inevitable, but its legacy remained, etched into stone and memory alike. The doors of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum may have closed in 1994, but what lingered inside memories, shadows, and perhaps even spirits ensured that the story of the asylum did not end. In many ways, its closing was not a conclusion, but the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by treatment and confinement, but by legend, investigation, and remembrance. Afterlife of the asylum. With its closure in 1994, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was left to decay, but the story of the building was far from over. Instead of being demolished like so many other outdated institutions, its immense stone structure loomed over Weston as a constant reminder of the past. The asylum had shifted from a place of containment to a place of memory, legend, and curiosity. At first, the building simply sat abandoned. Windows were shattered by vandals. Weeds pushed through the cracked pavement, and rust consumed the iron bars that once confined thousands. Locals avoided the grounds at night, claiming to hear strange noises, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, distant screams carried on the wind. Teenagers dared each other to break in, and urban explorers crept through its halls with flashlights, documenting the eerie emptiness. The asylum had closed, but in the eyes of the town, it had never truly died. The building's fate might have been sealed had it not been for a growing cultural fascination with abandoned places. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, paranormal tourism and dark history had become a booming trend. The Trans-Allegheny Asylum, with its immense Gothic architecture and chilling reputation, was a perfect candidate. Instead of rotting into obscurity, it was reborn as a site of exploration and storytelling. In 2007, preservationists stepped in to purchase the asylum. Their goal was not just to save the building, but to reinterpret it. Guided tours began, offering visitors a chance to walk the same halls where patients once lived and died. Some tours focused on history, overcrowding, treatments, and scandals, while others leaned into the supernatural, inviting guests to experience the asylum's haunted reputation firsthand. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, and soon the Trans-Allegheny Asylum became a fixture on television shows like Ghost Hunters and Paranormal State. For the town of Weston, the asylum's afterlife was transformative. Once a source of shame and sorrow, it became an unlikely economic engine. Tourism surged, hotels filled, and local businesses thrived from the influx of visitors. The asylum, which had drained resources during its operation, now brought them in. What had once been a burden was repurposed into an asset. Yet, this afterlife was not without controversy. Some argued that turning the asylum into a tourist attraction trivialized the suffering of thousands who had lived and died there. They claimed ghost tours sensationalized tragedy, reducing human misery to spectacle. Others countered that preserving the building and sharing its stories honored its history more than letting it collapse into ruin. The debate continues, balancing remembrance and exploitation. Visitors today describe the experience as unforgettable. By day, the asylum is a monument to history. Peeling paint, rusting beds, and hallways lined with wheelchairs tell a story of neglect. By night, it becomes something different. Ghost tours plunge guests into darkness, guiding them by flashlight through wards said to echo with phantom footsteps. Paranormal investigators camp in the lobotomy theater, waiting for signs of activity. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, The atmosphere is undeniable heavy, watchful, alive. In this way, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has entered its afterlife not as a forgotten ruin, but as a living legend. It stands at the intersection of history and folklore, science and superstition. Its walls no longer confine the insane, but they do confine memory, holding fast to the stories of those who pass through. Visitors leave with chills, questions, and a sense that they have stepped into a place where the past refuses to let go. The afterlife of Trans-Allegheny is proof that some buildings do not die when their function ends. They shift, transform, and take on new meanings. The asylum may no longer be a hospital, but in its new role, it continues to shape the town, the people, and the stories we tell about madness, suffering, and the human spirit. Ghost hunters and investigations. By the early 21st century, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had become a magnet for paranormal investigators from across the country. Its reputation as one of the most haunted places in America was cemented not only by local lore, but by national media, which seized upon the asylum's eerie history to create unforgettable television. Television shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, and Paranormal State flocked to the site, bringing with them cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and an eager audience. Episodes filmed in the asylum showed investigators wandering its decaying halls, calling out to unseen presences and recording disembodied voices. In one famous moment, a thermal camera allegedly captured the figure of a man walking across a hallway before vanishing. Another investigation recorded what some interpreted as the screams of women echoing from the empty wards. Not all evidence was so dramatic. Much of what investigators reported was as subtle cold spots, whispers, flickering lights, or sudden drops in temperature. In the lobotomy theater, many claimed to feel a heavy, oppressive energy, as though the room itself remembered the trauma inflicted within. In the violent ward, investigators often described a sense of being watched, accompanied by unexplained footsteps in the dark. Beyond television, countless independent paranormal groups made pilgrimages to Trans-Allegheny. Armed with digital recorders, infrared cameras, and motion detectors, they sought proof of what so many already believed, that the asylum's dead were not at rest. Some left with startling EV's electronic voice phenomena recordings that seemed to capture voices answering questions. Others reported shadows darting across hallways, doors slamming shut on their own, or even being touched by unseen hands. Perhaps the most famous ghost story tied to investigations is that of Lily, a spirit said to be the ghost of a young girl who died within the asylum. Paranormal teams often leave toys in her room, reporting that balls move on their own or music boxes begin to play without being wound. Many investigators claim Lily's presence is gentle, even playful, in contrast to the darker energies that dominate other wards. Critics argue that much of this evidence is circumstantial or the product of overactive imaginations fueled by the asylum's atmosphere. Skeptics point out that old buildings creak, drafts cause cold spots, and sound can carry in strange ways. Yet even skeptics admit that the sheer number of consistent reports across decades is difficult to ignore. Something about Trans-Allegheny inspires belief, whether supernatural or psychological. The asylum's owners leaned into this reputation, offering overnight ghost hunts where participants could roam the halls with equipment and conduct their own investigations. These tours became immensely popular, drawing thrill seekers, amateur investigators, and even skeptics curious to test their courage. Many reported leaving with experiences they could not explain. In academic circles, the investigations themselves became a subject of study. Sociologists analyzed why people are drawn to haunted places, while psychologists explored the effects of suggestion and fear in shaping human perception. Trans-Allegheny became a living laboratory not only for ghost hunters, but for those studying belief itself. Whether genuine hauntings or the power of imagination, the investigations cemented Trans-Allegheny's reputation. It was no longer just a historical site or an abandoned hospital. It had become a stage where the living sought to confront the dead, where television audiences could peer into the darkness, and where every creak, whisper, and flicker of light carried the weight of possibility. To this day, the asylum remains a pilgrimage site for paranormal enthusiasts. Each investigation adds new layers to its legend, ensuring that its story continues to grow. For believers, it is proof that the spirits of patients and staff linger still. For skeptics, it is a case study in fear and suggestion. For everyone, it is unforgettable. Modern dark tourism. In the decades since its closure, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has transformed from a crumbling relic into one of the most infamous sites of dark tourism in the United States. Each year, thousands of visitors flock to Weston, West Virginia, not to seek treatment or to mourn the past, but to experience firsthand the atmosphere of one of America's most haunted landmarks. The asylum's modern identity is a blend of preservation, history, and spectacle. By day, visitors can walk guided tours that trace the institution's long and tragic history. These tours highlight the building's architecture, recount the overcrowding and neglect, and display artifacts ranging from medical equipment to handwritten patient records. Guides recount the personal stories of patients, adding humanity to the statistics. The experience is sobering, grounding visitors in the reality that the asylum was once filled with people whose lives were marked by suffering. By night, however, the asylum becomes something entirely different. Paranormal tours plunge guests into darkness, arming them with flashlights and inviting them to wander halls where shadows linger. Ghost hunts offer participants the chance to use investigative equipment, digital recorders, EMF meters, thermal cameras, turning the asylum into a playground for those eager to confront the unknown. These experiences blur the line between education and entertainment, history and horror. Events and festivals further solidify the asylum's place in dark tourism. Around Halloween, the grounds host haunted attractions that draw massive crowds, combining theatrical scares with the building's genuine atmosphere. Some critics argue that such events trivialize the suffering of former patients, reducing tragedy to amusement. Supporters counter that these events fund preservation efforts, ensuring the asylum's survival. The debate underscores the complexity of memorializing places steeped in pain. Economic impact is undeniable. Once a struggling community, Weston now thrives on the asylum's reputation. Hotels, restaurants, and shops benefit from the steady influx of tourists. For many residents, the asylum is no longer a source of shame, but a symbol of resilience, repurposed for survival. The building that once drained the town's resources now sustains it. Dark tourism at Trans-Allegheny also attracts academics and cultural critics. Scholars analyze why people are drawn to sites of suffering, arguing that places like the asylum serve as mirrors of collective fear and fascination. Visitors often describe the experience as both thrilling and sobering, a confrontation with the fragility of sanity and the cruelty of history. In this way, the asylum becomes more than entertainment, it becomes a cultural touchstone, forcing reflection on how society treats its most vulnerable. Yet the ethical questions remain. Is it right to profit from tragedy? Are ghost hunts and haunted houses a form of exploitation or a necessary means of preservation? For every critic who condemns the commercialization of the asylum, there's another who argues that keeping the building alive through tourism ensures that its history is not forgotten. As long as visitors leave with both chills and questions, perhaps the asylum serves its purpose. In the end, modern dark tourism has given the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum a new kind of life. No longer a decaying ruin, it stands as both a memorial and a marketplace, a place where past and present intersect. Visitors may arrive seeking fear or fascination, but they depart with something deeper. A reminder that behind the ghost stories and attractions lie thousands of human lives, whose echoes still linger in the stone. The asylum's survival into the modern era demonstrates the enduring power of dark tourism. It is not only the building's size or architecture that draws crowds, but the weight of history itself. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has become a stage where memory, myth, and commerce meet, where madness still lingers, and where the line between horror and history is forever blurred. Skeptics versus believers. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, like many historic sites with reputations for hauntings, stands at the intersection of belief and skepticism. For every visitor who swears they encountered a ghost in its halls, there's another who insists the experiences can be explained by psychology, physics, or imagination. The debate over the asylum's supernatural legacy mirrors broader cultural divides: science versus faith, evidence versus intuition, reason versus fear. Believers point to the sheer volume of testimonies collected over decades. Nurses, guards, patients, journalists, and tourists have all reported strange phenomena. Footsteps in empty corridors, objects moving on their own, and voices captured on tape. Paranormal investigators cite the asylum's tragic history: thousands of deaths, untold suffering, and emotional trauma is the fuel that keeps spirits tethered to the building. To them, the asylum is a reservoir of psychic energy, a place where the veil between worlds has been permanently thinned. Some believers are not casual thrill seekers, but serious researchers. They bring specialized equipment: thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and digital recorders, and carefully document their findings. Groups have cataloged hundreds of EVPs, unexplained shadows, and temperature anomalies. Skeptics dismiss much of this as technical glitches or suggestibility, but believers argue the consistency of experiences across different groups and decades cannot be ignored. Skeptics, however, present compelling counterarguments. Old buildings creak, they say. Drafts explain cold spots, and poor wiring causes lights to flicker. Human psychology does the rest. In an environment as charged as the asylum, expectation shapes perception. When visitors are told the building is haunted, they're primed to interpret every sound or shadow as paranormal. Fear alters senses, adrenaline sharpens awareness, and the brain fills in gaps with imagined threats. Historians also weigh in, cautioning against conflating folklore with fact. They argue that sensationalizing hauntings risks obscuring the real history of neglect, abuse, and human suffering that define the asylum. By focusing on ghosts, we risk forgetting the lives of actual patients whose voices were silenced. For some, the ghost stories dishonor their memory. For others, they serve as metaphors, expressions of trauma too vast to be fully articulated. The debate often plays out during tours. Guides recount chilling stories of apparitions and phantom footsteps, while skeptics in the group roll their eyes, pointing out mundane explanations. Yet even skeptics sometimes admit to leaving unsettled. The sheer scale of the building, its oppressive silence, and its history of misery create an ambience difficult to dismiss. As one visitor put it, "I don't believe in ghosts, but something about that place got under my skin." This tension between skepticism and belief is part of the asylum's enduring power. It is not simply a haunted house or a historic ruin, it is a stage where these worldviews clash. Paranormal enthusiasts and rationalists alike leave with strong impressions, whether of spirits encountered or of human imagination at work. The asylum provokes not just fear, but debate. Some suggest that the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps the hauntings are not literal ghosts, but the emotional residue of trauma absorbed into the stones of the asylum. Or perhaps they are manifestations of the human need to make sense of suffering, to give voice to those who were silenced. Whether supernatural or psychological, the effect is real. People leave Trans-Allegheny changed. In the end, the asylum's power does not depend on proof. It lies in its ambiguity. Believers find confirmation of the unseen. Skeptics find evidence of human psychology. Both leave with stories to tell. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum remains, above all, a mirror reflecting back our fears, our doubts, and our endless fascination with the boundary between life and death. Legacy, where madness still lingers. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands today not only as a monument of stone, but as a monument of memoria place where madness, suffering, and legend intertwine. Its legacy is as complicated as the building itself. Part history, part folklore, part cautionary tale. For historians, the asylum is a case study in the evolution of mental health care. It reflects the lofty ideals of the Kirkbride Plan, the collapse under overcrowding, and the dark chapter of experimental treatments. It is a reminder of how societies can begin with compassion, only to lose their way in the face of neglect and fear. The stone walls of Trans-Allegheny preserve a story not just of medicine, but of humanity's struggle to understand and care for its most vulnerable. For the town of Weston, the asylum's legacy is deeply personal. Once a source of employment and shame, it has become a centerpiece of tourism and identity. Residents live in its shadow, balancing pride in its preservation with unease at its past. Some see it as a wound that never fully healed, others as a resource that ensures the town's survival. Either way, the asylum is inseparable from the fabric of the community. For paranormal enthusiasts, Trans-Allegheny is hallowed ground. Its halls are said to echo with whispers of the dead, its wards alive with restless spirits. Ghost hunters return year after year, convinced they are brushing against something beyond comprehension. Whether these presences are real or imagined, they sustain the asylum's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. Skeptics, too, find meaning in the asylum. To them, it is a powerful example of the human tendency to mythologize tragedy. They argue that the ghost stories reveal more about our collective psyche than about the supernatural. In this view, Trans-Allegheny's legacy lies not in spirits, but in the way its history has been shaped, retold, and transformed into legend. The asylum's cultural impact extends far beyond Weston. It has appeared in documentaries, television shows, books, and films. Scholars cite it in studies of dark tourism, trauma, and collective memory. Tourists travel across the country to walk its halls, seeking both fear and understanding. Each encounter adds another layer to its mythos, ensuring its story endures. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of the asylum's legacy is the silence of those who lived and died there. Thousands of patients entered its gates, many never left. Their names are carved into ledgers, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, their voices faint echoes in forgotten journals. They're the true legacy of Trans-Allegheny, not the ghost tours or the television specials, but the human beings whose suffering gave rise to the legend. Walking the halls today, one cannot help but feel their presence not necessarily as spirits, but as reminders. Each peeling wall, each rusted bed frame, each barred window is a testimony. They remind us of what happens when compassion fails, when institutions lose sight of humanity, and when society chooses to confine rather than to care. In this sense, madness still lingers at Trans-Allegheny, not just in whispers or shadows, but in the lessons it teaches. It lingers in the ethical debates about dark tourism, in the fascination of paranormal investigators, in the economic life of Weston, and in the pages of history books. It lingers because the asylum forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about suffering, memory, and the human condition. The legacy of Trans-Allegheny is not easily defined. It is tragedy and resilience, horror and fascination, past and present entwined. Its walls no longer confine patients, but they still confine history, holding fast to a story that America cannot and should not forget. As long as its towers rise over Weston, the asylum will remain a place where madness, in one form or another, still lingers.